Good evening, everyone. Tonight it is our pleasure to welcome Carrie Yamaoka to the School of Visual Arts. Carrie is a New York-based and Glen Cove, New York-born artist whose work involves painting, photography, and sculpture. When describing her work, she often uses terms like topography, surface, tactility, visibility, chance, chemical reaction, and also chemical action, and transformation. I might add 3 adjectives to this list: cool, critical, and conceptual. Her work has been featured in solo exhibitions at Commonwealth and Council in Los Angeles, I feel like this is a little live, Commonwealth and Council in Los Angeles, Ulterior Gallery here in New York City, Henry Art Gallery at University of Washington in Seattle, Studio 1.1 in London, Galerie Une in Auvergne, Switzerland, Galerie Long and Pult in Zurich, Switzerland, Debs & Co., which is a terrific gallery, was a terrific gallery in New York City, and Aeroplastics Contemporary in Brussels. The list of group exhibitions that have included Carrie's work is longer than my arm. And I'll list a few that jumped out at me. Galerie Perrotin in Paris, the Centre Pompidou in Paris, the Philadelphia Institute of Contemporary Art, M17 Contemporary Art Center in Kyiv, Ukraine, the Leslie Lohman Museum here in New York, Galerie Praz de la Vallade in Paris, Essex Flowers here in New York, Camera Club New York at Baxter Street, Leslie Heller Workspace, Asia Geisberg Gallery here in New York, Momenta Art, RIP in Brooklyn, Artist Space here in New York, Mass Mocha in North Adams, Massachusetts, near Williamstown, the Contemporary Museum in Baltimore, New Langton Arts in San Francisco, White Columns here in New York, Hall Walls in Buffalo, Longwood Arts Project in the Bronx, Asian American Art Center here in New York, and last but not least, the Victoria and Albert Museum in London. Writing about her work has appeared in the New York Times, Art Forum, Art in America, The New Yorker, Time Out New York, Hyperallergic, Interview, and Bomb. Her work's included in several art collections, museum collections, including the Albright Knox Gallery in Buffalo, right? The Art Institute of Chicago, the Dallas Museum of Art, Henry Art Gallery, and the Centre Pompidou in Paris. She's received the John Simon Guggenheim Fellowship and also the Anonymous Was a Woman Award. She's a founding member of the queer art collective Fierce Pussy and is represented by Commonwealth and Council in Los Angeles, where she'll have a solo show next month, or in January, rather, 2023. Closer to home, her solo show at the Zika Gallery at Wesleyan University in Middletown, Connecticut, will open in late January 2023. Carrie received a BA from Wesleyan University, and while there, she attended the Tyler School of Art in Rome. Please join me again in giving a very warm welcome to Carrie Yamaoka.
Thank you, Mark. First, I'd like to thank Mark and Isabel and Nelson for inviting me here to speak to you all today. I'm going to start with a kind of brief overview of my practice, and then I'm going to go back in time a little bit to a long time ago before any of you were born. And then I'm going to zip forward to the present again. So, and I probably will read my presentation, but I'll kind of digress with, little asides in there. I'd like to start with this image of a work from 2009. This was titled 36 by 36, clear number 2. It was comprised of silver mylar, or what I also call reflective polyester film, mounted to wood panel and encapsulated in layers of clear urethane resin. I say was titled because I'm currently working back into the work, as I have been doing for the past several years. So this work, as you see it here, no longer exists. But more about that process and idea later on. For now, let's look at what we see here on the screen. It's 36 inches wide by 36 inches tall by 2 inches deep. Towards the top of the image area, you see a pipe running across my studio ceiling, and towards the bottom, you'll notice the camera on a tripod set on self-timer, taking the photograph. For the past 27 years, I've been making paintings using reflective polyester film as the ground. Sometimes I'm reluctant to call them paintings. Sometimes I insist they're called paintings. So my practice ranges across painting, sculpture, drawing, and photography. I like to say I'm working in the expanded field of painting, trying to push the envelope of the medium using materials and processes I have developed through experimentation and exploration. My interest in process and the alchemy of materials has led me away from traditional painting media and toward the use of other materials. Here is another work from around the same time, a little larger with a lot more surface incident due to all the air bubbles and things happening beneath the surface of the silver mylar. So that space between the back of the mylar and the wood panel that it's mounted on. The surface arrived at is partially dependent on what and how I mount the silver mylar to the panel with. The dark and light forms that appear are not painted in or composed, but rather what was in my studio being reflected in the surface when the photo was taken. I don't paint with a brush. I try not to make pictures. There's no narrative. It's the relationship of the viewer to the object / picture that I'm most interested in. I'm setting up conditions for the viewer to have the experience of engaging with the object or picture that they are complicit in the realization of in a particular site within a particular moment in time. The work is a challenge to photograph, as you can see, because of the reflective ground. So documenting the work presents a dilemma. Me and or my camera are always making an appearance. But ultimately, the photographs always fail to represent the experience of the work. A photograph describes only one particular stance, one particular moment. It fails to capture the flux and mutability of viewing the work in the round and in time. Also, the camera frames and sees differently than the viewer does. This problem, or this failure, is also interesting to me. And I have to embrace the impossibility of capture here. I've been working with chemical and mechanical abrasives to both erase the reflective coating of the mylar and to pick up the textures of the simplest, most banal material at hand in the studio. And that would be like the wall, the floor, and bubble wrap. Where I rub, the reflective coating is erased and the transparent base of the mylar film is revealed. Sometimes you'll see that the marks are black or gray or white, and this is from the paint which I apply on the other side of the mylar, behind it, as it were. Random variations in pressure create differing densities of imprint, arriving at imperfect tactile records. I'm going to show you two images because I mostly showed you really frontal images of the work, but these are two photos. The first is a very large scale rubbing of my studio wall, and it was shot in my studio in Brooklyn. The second is an installation shot from Greater New York in 2015 at MoMA PS1. And I'm kind of showing you both images because I want to stress how, since you're not seeing the work in person, how photographs really, the work looks completely different depending on where it's situated, what the lighting situation is, the angle from which the work is photographed. Let's see, mixed up papers here. I tend to use materials and processes in ways that let a window open up between chance and intention. I use a strategy of breaking rules to arrive at that intersection. And by rules, I mean, materials have certain protocols, like when you work with resin, there's a particular ratio that you're supposed to mix the part A and part B with, or other rules like paint doesn't like to stick to plastic, so it crawls. So beyond the additive and reductive processes typically employed in painting, I also use materials to invite and engage chance and error and defect, the lifting off of paint, the peeling, the cracking, the crawling. This is a work that's titled 40 by 30 clear/black, and it's made with urethane resin on black vinyl that's mounted to a wood panel. The resin doesn't want to stick to the surface, so it creeps and crawls and resists and finally, eventually sets up. This is an angle shot of the same painting that you saw previously. But so again, you can see how completely different the camera frames the view. And so likewise, the viewer does the same thing as they navigate through the space. Okay, jumping backwards now in time to the late 1980s, early 1990s. I want to go way back in order to draw the connections between the older work that I was involved with then and the work I'm engaged with now. Around 1987, I began to work with text, and all of my text was found, derived from typewriter correction ribbons. Back before computers, when electric typewriters were the things we used, there were two ribbons in these machines, very, very analog. One was the black ribbon that contained black ink with which you typed your text. And the other was a white ribbon, was the correction ribbon that you used to erase things that you didn't want, that you realized were mistakes or that you didn't want to say after all. So this correction ribbon I thought of it as like a record of error and a record of unwanted text. I collected these correction ribbons from friends who were writers, friends who worked in offices and museums and magazines. I transcribed the correction ribbons. And as I worked in the production department of various magazines for my day job, back then I asked my friends to typeset these sheets of transcriptions of error. And I made photostats of them because I worked in the stat room. And I used the photostats as the ground in paintings and drawings. Using both deleted words and chance juxtapositions of letters that formed words for me, it was like sifting and scavenging through the garbage can to find my vocabulary. And I think if one feels that one is situated on the margins for any number of reasons, one might look to find oneself and one's voice there. I was using beeswax mixed with dry pigment and various tinting agents, mostly media that had a degree of translucency to it. I compiled my lexicon of found words, and this served as the source for other works not built on the ground of the transcription photostat. Then moving forward a little bit to the early 90s, the AIDS crisis was raging, friends were dying, and the culture wars were being fought at local school boards and libraries and arts institutions. Books that had so-called undesirable or dangerous content, frank sexuality, both hetero and homo, and radical political content were being banned from school libraries, very much like the present moment. I chose 12 books to work with, books that had either been banned from import into the US or banned from school libraries. Here was another kind of detritus, but one that held some canonical modernist works and some renegade outliers. The Well of Loneliness by Radcliffe Hall, Another Country by James Baldwin, Naked Lunch by William Burroughs, Lolita, Tropic of Cancer, Catcher in the Rye. I shot the photos directly from these books and worked back into the gelatin silver prints with chemical reducing agents to partially erase and edit the text for my own ends. And this one is Steal This Book, #2, from a late 1960s how-to manual for activists by Abby Hoffman. It's quite an interesting book. You can find all kinds of recipes for things like Molotov cocktails and then more theoretical kind of strategizing for how to pull off different kinds of direct action. Anyway, this was definitely banned from school libraries. And in this work, I'm really drawn to the doubling that happens in the language. So there's the doubling of reads, like, is it the history of slaughter? Or is it an exhortation to slaughter history? That little stain that you see at the bottom that runs along is actually something that happened a little later, and a couple of years after I made this, and I thought, oh shit, I'm gonna have to cut this print down and then it won't be the same size as all the other works in the series. But then I realized when I looked at it that I actually loved that stain because it was, I lived in Hoboken at the time in a loft with a very leaky roof. And that was rainwater seeping in down into my studio. And that's what caused that brown stain. And I actually really love this print even more now that it has that stain and that residue. This was Naked Lunch taken from Naked Lunch by William Burroughs. This is from Lolita by Vladimir Nabokov. This is from Another Country by James Baldwin. From 1991 to 94, I worked on a series called Archipelagos off and on while I was doing other works that were not at all text related, but it was a cycle of photograms, each one a unique gelatin silver print. The work was structured around an incomplete alphabet and a landscape of incarceration. Names of institutions, sites, and places in the US where people have been sequestered or imprisoned or interned, perhaps even treated, prisons, hospitals, internment camps. These places housed immigrants, people who break the law, people deemed insane, people with HIV/AIDS, Japanese Americans during World War II. I was interested in the naming of the places and the contrast between the poetry of the place name, its multiple resonances, and the reality of its function. This particular panel is Heart Mountain, which was an internment camp in Wyoming during World War II for Japanese Americans. And it was the name of the place and the camp was taken from the mountain, which it sat under, which was named Heart Mountain by the indigenous Native American people who lived there because they thought that the mountain resembled a buffalo heart. So that's the place name, but also the name of the camp. The prints were made using photographic processes, not shot with a camera, but exposed and made in the darkroom. Some of the prints are underexposed, some are overexposed, some are solarized or intentionally out of focus. In some of the prints, I've used bleaching agents to manipulate and reduce the image. And any color that you see, like all of that sort of, the color is not very good on this monitor, but there's a kind of pinkish yellowish tone that, it's black and white paper, but the color that occurs in the prints is a byproduct of the process, not an additive coloring agent. None of these prints would be considered proper photographic prints in the sense that they are all intentionally improperly made. 1994, I abandoned text in my work. The AIDS crisis had a profound effect on the work I was making. It felt like words failed, and I craved a more direct mode of address. I was experimenting with glass mirror, stripping it using various chemicals and processes to try and disrupt the crystal clear reflection on the glass. painting and transferring different kinds of material on top of it. But it soon became clear to me that glass mirror always retains its very hard objective appearance, no matter how much one tries to mess with it. So I wanted more malleability and more of the material I could manipulate, one that would easily take a mark or an impression. And that led me to start working with silver mylar or reflective polyester film, as I call it. The material has a plastic film base that is coated with a silver coating on one side. Its uses in the world might be anything from gift wrap to lining the walls of hothouses and grow houses. I even kind of like the idea of its cheesiness and its shiny factor, the notion of perhaps incorporating and transcending that somehow simultaneously. This is a painting from 1995, one of the first in which I used silver mylar. I burnished and rubbed the surface, which is what the swishy appearance, what created the swishy appearance there. And I poured resin on top, placing it outdoors at night in the countryside. I ran an electric clamp light out to it and waited for insects to be lured onto the surface and get stuck there and die. Quite an exercise in cruelty in retrospect. I very soon realized that the cruelty was totally unnecessary, but it did serve to help me understand that I was more interested in how the viewer would position themselves in relation to the work based on the dynamic of attraction and repulsion to seeing oneself and one's surroundings reflected back. So I abandoned the clamp light and the insects. This is a painting titled 36 by 36 in parentheses clear that dates from 2006, measures 36 inches square by 2 inches deep, and it's made of reflective polyester film and urethane resin on wood panel. And it's a straightforward frontal shot. What you see contained within the image area of the painting is my studio. It's the tripod sits in the middle, camera set to self-timer. I moved in this direction in the mid-90s, also partly because I began to feel that there were too many pictures in the world. I didn't want to add to the glut of images. And it seemed to me that we'd become unaccustomed to being an active agent in the act of looking. And I think that's true now, even more so. We're constantly bombarded with images everywhere. Here's another shot of the same painting in the same place from a different angle. And here's another shot of the same painting installed at a gallery in Brussels in 2009. As a teenager, I had been very involved in photography, which was, of course, analog back in those days. And this early passion for both shooting and for working in the darkroom has continued to inform my practice. I'm interested in that liminal moment when freshly exposed photo paper is immersed in the developer tray. For those of you who know how darkrooms work. And the latent image begins to form, but has not yet coalesced into a recognizable picture. That moment of suspension between the process of becoming visible and the legibility of form. And I strive to capture something of that dynamic to invite the viewer into that fleeting moment. And so, while it's traditionally assumed that the ideal vantage point for a viewer is to position themselves in front of the painting in order to apprehend the picture, I'm seeking a different relationship between the viewer and the work. The viewer sees that the picture is in constant flux, determined by their own movement and agency in relationship to the object. One's compelled to view the painting from various angles and stances. The viewer becomes aware that the painting occupies a physical space in the room, and being reflective to some degree, it depicts the site within which it is encountered. This is an installation shot of a work made of silver mylar and resin and tint. It's unsupported. There's no wood panel behind it. There's no support, but it is rigid because it's hard resin. And that was from that same exhibition in Brussels in 2009. And the green speck that you see in the middle is a painting hanging on the opposite wall. And the blurred form in the lower center area is me and my tripod shooting the work. Here's another view of the same work, but sited in a different space. It's in my then studio in Brooklyn. And same work, different angle in that same studio. I've also been often casting flexible resin with mylar in molds, encapsulating the mylar within the mold. This is a piece titled 72 by 18 parentheses blue fade from 2009. It starts on the wall and bends onto the floor. It's attached at the top with a 2-inch strip of Velcro. Velcro is very strong. It holds an incredible amount of weight, just so you know. I tinted the resin with a blue tint, and then I placed the mold on a tilt so that the more intense chroma would collect at one end of the mold, creating a kind of gradient. So, you know, I chose to hang the work counterintuitively with the darker area of the darker blue at the top of the piece. This is another cast flexible resin piece. It has 2 parts. It spans a corner and the sort of connection between the wall to the floor. And installation of this work is variable. As long as it's installed in a corner, it can be installed in any number of different configurations. That's the rule that I made around it. So you might see it in a different situation, and the big, long, skinny piece might be starting on the wall and going onto the floor, and the shorter, stouter piece might be on the other side, close to the floor. There are many, many different configurations one could use. This is another cast flexible resin piece which wraps around the corner. And again, like the resin is flexible, so it's bendable. Another cast resin work that, although it's bendable, I'm not using the bendability in this work. And then about 10 years ago, I started to drain a lot of the color and the intense chroma out of my work. I felt that the seduction of color obscured the core concerns of the work, and I also wanted to restrict the palette so that the latent and incipient color could be more apparent. This is a diptych that's titled recto/verso. I'd been looking for a material that was close to silver mylar, but different, like something that had more of a body to it and a vinyl base. So I found this vinyl material that was silver on one side and black on the other. I became more fascinated with the black side, what one sees in the black ground, and I've worked a lot with the black side of this material since then. I was also thinking about the idea of the verso, the side that one does not see if one is looking at the recto, and teasing out the possibility of having both at the same time. This then in turn brought me back to the silver mylar and the ability to work with its translucent or transparent base that I was revealing through stripping the silver away. The idea that one could see through to the other side intrigued me. The idea that there was paint happening behind the surface. The fact that the reflective polyester film could be used as a kind of pre-photographic means of recording, taking indexical records of unseen things in my studio, the floor, the wall, bubble wrap. This painting is made from a rubbing of bubble wrap, and the black color you see is happening behind the surface, between the wood panel and the back of the silver mylar. This is a detail shot, and the crackly pattern of rivulets that you see in the center is the result of the not completely dry black paint, which was acrylic, interacting with the glue that I'm using to mount the piece to the wood panel. And these are the kinds of let's call them, I don't like to call them accidents, but these are the kind of surprises and unexpected things that happen in the process that I'm always looking for. The dot pattern derived from bubble wrap brings an array of associations from honeycomb to dot screens to pixels to cells. Surfing the gamut between randomness and order, the variegated dot pattern formed teases with the viewer's tendency, a reflex almost, to look for an image, to find an image. I want the viewer to lurk in that limbo, that place before an image is arrived at. I'm interested in the topography of surfaces, the tactility of the barely visible or unnoticed, and the whole chain of incidents that determine the outcome of the finished object. The viewer is placed at the intersection between a record of chemical action/reaction and the desire to apprehend a picture emerging in the fleeting and unstable states of transformation. The reflective ground is analogous, I think, in my mind, to the film plane of a camera, a plane upon which the image is never fixed in this case. So light never appears to strike the painting the same way twice. I'm interested in the antithesis of the decisive moment. The picture arrived at in any given moment is contingent upon the viewer's stance in relationship to the work and their navigation through the space that the painting occupies and reflects. The viewer is implicated as both pictorial subject when present or absent, and as editor. The viewer makes and remakes the picture from the conditions that I've set up. I'm also interested in negotiations with chance and ways of working blindly. And by that, I mean setting up conditions for something to occur, but not composing or controlling the outcome entirely. Here, I'm working flat and I lay down my plastic sheeting first, which is like a protective sheeting just so that the paint doesn't go all over my studio. And then I lay out the silver mylar. And the plastic sheeting comes in a roll and it has its own creases and folds built into it, which end up determining where the denser areas of paint settle on top of the silver mylar in this case. This is another example of working, what I call working blindly. I lay the paint down all over the silver mylar, like I roll it out or brush it out maybe. And then I roll it up before it's completely dry. It's kind of still tacky. And then I let it dry, and then I unroll it when it's completely dry. And the paint lifts off in random patches onto the verso side, which is the side you end up seeing here in this painting. This is a cast resin work where I mixed the resin in wrong proportions, which caused it to expand up and out of the mold and inflate, basically, and bubble up in these very strange ways. I was really excited when this happened, even though you could say it was an accident or a mistake, but again, this is the kind of accident or mistake that I'm always looking for. And I was a little concerned about, because it was quite thick, I was concerned about whether the resin deep inside that form would in fact cure. I mean, it probably would have, but I waited a couple of days and it looked like it was still liquid. So I was just a little worried about that for whatever reason, which when I look back on it is kind of ridiculous because eventually it probably would have cured. But anyway, I punctured the form into spots, which caused the resin to ooze out and set up in those formations. And that sits on the floor, that is. That's a detail shot of that sculpture. So you get an idea of the surface and how kind of bubbly and inflected it is. Okay, so for the past several years, I've been going back through my older works and I've been reconfiguring them and rehabilitating some of them destroying the works, transforming them into new works. Some of these were unresolved or unfinished works I had kept around for one reason or another. Usually there was something I found compelling, otherwise I would have trashed it. Some of the older works I thought were perfectly acceptable and finished and even good 20 years ago. But looking at them now with fresh eyes, I saw the limitations of the protocol I was working under at the time, and it no longer worked for me. So I'm also interested in that, how, you know, one always sets up criteria and protocols for what is allowed within one's practice, let's say, at any given time. And those protocols are always evolving and changing as one goes. So these next images show that trajectory of working back into work. This is a work called Crawl/Bend, which I reconfigured in 2015. It previously hung tacked to the wall like a painting, but with no support behind it. And it wasn't really working for me. But when I realized I could allow it to curl from the wall onto the floor, it suddenly clicked. And all of that crawling, wet, liquid, frozen in motion suddenly had a relationship to one's own sense of gravity. That's a detail shot. This is another work that I reconfigured in 2015, and it's called Pour/Peel. Pour as in POUR /Peel, PEEL. This was a work of silver mylar and urethane resin on wood panel. It was 68 by 32 inches, and it was just unfinished, unresolved, abandoned for years. It stood in the corner of my studio. So I ripped it off the panel in 3 sections, and it became a 3-part sculptural work that leans against the wall. You'll notice that the 3 parts overlap in a particular configuration, and that so this is not, the rules here are, this is not changeable. These 3 parts need to always be installed in this way, leaning. So I have a map for it. It's pretty precise. And the tearing of the material from the support left what seemed like marks, but they are actually areas where the silver mylar got left behind, leaving blank, transparent areas where you can see through to what's sitting behind it. And like that dark form in the lower right quadrant is actually me just sitting in my studio taking a picture of it. This is a work called Peeled Diptych #2. It's from 2018. And because of the way I work, I have to do a lot of tests. I do a lot of tests of materials. And this came out of a test I had done of resin that had a light blue tint mixed with titanium white on just a sheet of defective brownish mylar. And I'd been working with this defective brownish mylar quite extensively at the time. And I kept this test as a note, even though I decided against using this blue colored tint. I tore the resin from the mylar and I set the 2 pieces side by side. So it was a kind of divorce, each side bearing the fragments of residue from its previous entanglement. This is a work called 18 by 18, and I think I originally made it in 2009, but it came, it was a piece that was cast in a flat plastic bag, and it retained all of the creases and the plastic and the air bubbles that were created in the process. I was thinking about the idea of the negative space of the interior of the bag. I wanted to turn the negative space into a positive form, which is basically what one does in casting. My quandary back in 2009 was that I couldn't decide whether it should be on the wall or on the floor. And I felt that it absolutely had to be, I had to make a decision one way or the other, and I really could not. So it kind of remained unresolved. But around 2018, I realized that was no longer true, that it could be hung on the wall or set on the floor, did not have to be either or, it could be either and. So in this instance, in an exhibition, I installed it on the floor, but in another exhibition, it was hung on the wall in that same year, so. Now, these next couple of works are made of that black vinyl that I was referring to earlier, mounted to wood panel. And I've not gone back and changed them, but they've been changing all by themselves. In each one, I made a fold or a crease in the vinyl, and then I unfolded it and mounted it to wood panel before coating it with resin. So it was an action that took place and then was recorded in a sense, done and undone. I discovered that over time, the resin lifted off ever so slightly in certain areas, presumably where the touch of my fingerprints had left a residue that acted as a resist. I found this out because the work was in a group show at Lucian Terras's Broome Street space. And one day he texted me and said, "Something is happening to your black painting. It looks like it's changed a little bit." So I asked him to send me a photo. And when I saw it, I was slightly horrified at first. I was like, uh-oh, no, not archival, unstable, and so on. But then I realized that there was something intriguing about it, a picture that can keep on developing long after it is considered finished. And I thought, wow, I want to try and work with that. So while the lifting action has progressed very incrementally over the ensuing years, I wouldn't characterize it as unstable. This is another work. You can see the fold running down the center of the, not the center, on the right side of the panel. I mean, what you can't really see from these images is there are also a lot of little incidents like air bubbles and things that you would see if you were seeing the piece in real life, but we have to go with the photos that, the very poor photos that don't really capture the work, but it's an approximation. So this is a work called Crawl Stretch from 2018. Crawl/stretch. And it's a work that's not changing, but it looks as though it could. It's made of urethane resin on black vinyl with no support, tacked to the wall, 85 inches by 48 inches. Now, certain paints and resins don't really want to bind to vinyl or plastic, so they crawl and beat up, and then they dry in that beaded up form. So looking wet, the wet liquid on a vertical surface, it seems like an impossibility, but in fact, there it is. This is a detail shot of that work. In 2019, I there are installation shots, these two next images, of a show that I did at Ulterior Gallery here in New York City. And it was called Panorama. And this is not the same Archipelagos that I showed you a picture of earlier on from the 90s. It's called Archipelagos 2019. So backtracking a little bit, back in 2018, in the middle of Trump's years, the migrant crisis at the southern border was erupting, and I felt compelled to go back into the darkroom and add 5 new panels to the original cycle of photograms, incorporating the names of ICE detention sites and private prisons to the 18 already existing panels. I had the opportunity to show the analog version of Archipelagos, which I showed you a shot of earlier, at the Henry in Seattle in 2019. And one of the issues that came up was the fact that these were a set of unique photograms, gelatin silver prints, and they would be exposed to light continuously for a long stretch of time. Partially because I insisted that at the Henry, there are these incredible skylights, and a lot of times they put shades on them because they don't really want a lot of natural light in the galleries. But I actually really wanted all natural light because I was fascinated by the idea that you could see the work on a, not this work, but the work that has reflective surfaces, that you could see the work on a cloudy day, or you could see the work on a bright sunny day, and it would really, just those changes in the weather would have an enormous impact on the experience of the work. So anyway, so I thought, okay, so I asked them to open the skylights, no shades on the skylights, and they were like, well, that's gonna make the prints deteriorate. It could damage them, it could cause them to fade. And this also became an interesting dilemma to me because the prints had sat in my flat files for many, many years when it was in the dark, unseen. Nobody wanted to show them. And now they were being exposed to light, being seen and made vulnerable because of it. And maybe the more I showed them, the more they would begin to disappear. And I embraced that fact and felt that that could perhaps in itself be an unintended but welcome consequence, which led me to decide to make a digital archival inkjet version of the work, which would become its own independent work, giving it more life, more permanence, more mobility. So at Ulterior in 2019, I exhibited the digital version of the work. And I was thinking this space, the previous Ulterior has moved since then, but in the storefront that they had on the Lower East Side was a very narrow space. And I liked the idea that this was a band running around the entire room, and that it formed almost a horizon in a sense, which very much has to do with notions of landscape that happen in the work. I'm just gonna run through the whole cycle of the digital cycle so you can see each panel. So in translating the analog to the digital cycle, here's what kind of happened. Over the intervening years from the 90s to, let's say, all the way up to 2019, I had taken photographs of archipelagos with every new and better digital camera that I got in an attempt to get, better documentation of the work. And I used these files as the source material for Archipelagos 2019. I was kind of interested in the mechanics of the process of introducing the camera into the mix where it had not been before, taking photographs of the photograms, which were made in a cameraless way, then outputting the prints in a more supposedly archival manner, allowing the tweaks of the technology to add its own incident somewhat, and additioning the prints so that they would exist as a multiple and could be exhibited more widely and more safely. I was also struck by the fact that some of these places had acquired new layers of association. For example, Guantanamo Bay in Cuba is one of the place names that's cited. It's the site of a US Army naval base. And in the early 1990s, it was used to detain Haitian refugees fleeing their country in the wake of the coup d'etat, including a number of HIV positive Haitians, and it was proposed as a possible quarantine detention facility for US citizens with HIV/AIDS at the time. Going on 20 years now, post 9/11, a prison camp for suspects in the forever war on terror, as you're probably familiar with. Okay, I'm going through, I'm not sure how that, Indian Creek, Ironwood, 2 different prisons. Sometimes there are just letters, there's no place named, because I wanted to leave open the possibility that there were sites that we do not yet know about or that have not yet been named. Sometimes there's no text at all, like in this one, which is photogram. Valverde was one of the newer panels that I added. One of the 5 new panels, and it's the name of a private prison in California, I believe, but there is a kind of, this is not just like a bad photograph, there is a kind of pixelation to the text in the actual photogram, so that's what you're seeing. Oh, there are also blank spaces, but I'm not subjecting you to the blank spaces. So there's some letters that aren't there, like K, Q, and Z do not exist either in this cycle. Okay, moving on to like really much more recent work, but still along the lines of this rehabilitation of older works. This is called 24 by 24 Redux, and it was, the date on it is 2001/2021. This is a work from 2001, which I ripped from its panel in 2 pieces. This first image was shot in my studio, and this second image is an installation view from a group show in Reykjavik last year. And the installation of this work is variable. The photos are just a few suggestions of different ways it can be installed. There are some rules that I've determined, like one of them is that the silver side is the only side to face out to the viewer, not the yellow gold side, which you're not even seeing here because it's facing the back. But part of the reason why I ripped it off the panel is because in 2001 I was using a resin that wasn't very stable and it yellowed quite a bit. So what had initially appeared as silver was now kind of a goldish color, and I really did not like that very much. So that's partly why I ripped it off the panel. So one of the rules is that the silver side is the only side to face out to the viewer. Another rule is that the 2 pieces must always be in relationship to the point where the wall meets the floor. And another rule is that only the straight edges are allowed to rest against the floor or the wall, not the curved edges. And the silver side is the previously unseen side, now exposed to view. So analogous, I think of it as, if you remember Polaroids, analogous to peeling a Polaroid with a 20-year interval in between, a kind of, and also kind of play on the notion of exposure. This is a work called Peeled, and its date is 2001/2021. It's also a work that I originally made like over 20 years ago. And in this case, there was no wood support ever. I ripped the resin off the silver mylar, and it took some of the fragments of silver mylar with it. This is another work that was also from the same series as the previous image. The color of the tint had shifted dramatically over the course of 20 years. So what was red in 2001 was now somehow an olive green. I was playing around with this in my studio, and I got the form to slump like that over onto itself. And I was drawn to that slumping of the form because it allows you to see both the recto and the verso simultaneously. And the color in this monitor is kind of off because it actually really is more of an olive green rather than that brownish tint you see. This is a recently peeled work where there's no panel, there's no resin, there's only the mylar. And so in the process of pouring this work originally, there was a lot of like torque and a lot of contortion. And so when I peeled it, the mylar, it's kind of like paper, the way paper has a memory, the mylar retained some of that gesture and some of that contortion. And this is another recently peeled work that, dates back maybe to 2005. It has two components, one that sits on the wall or leans on the wall, and the other one on the floor. And in this case, the rule is that it can be installed in any number of different configurations. So it doesn't have to be as you see it here. It could be, the piece that's on the floor could be set quite a ways away from the one that's on the wall. It depends on the site and the way in which it's situated. I think I would make the decision based on that. And lately, I've also been, I told you I'd been taking all the color out of my work around 2009, but lately I've been returning to working with color. This resin that was tinted blue was poured over a painting that was kind of a dud. It was a rubbing of bubble wrap, but not very interesting. So I poured this blue on it, but new resin doesn't like to adhere to old resin generally. So it crawled away from the bottom edge. And lately, I'm also really interested in the form and the space of the air bubbles that occur in the work. So I'm thinking of these as voids that might either be filled or left empty. This is very small. It's about 10 inches by 8 inches on wood panel. And this is another recent work that, again, there you'll see this. It might be hard to see in this slide, but I rolled the tinted white. I tinted the resin white, titanium white, and I rolled it out on plastic. And it doesn't want to stick to plastic, but it does dry. And then I peeled it off the plastic, and in peeling it, I took all the weird bubbles and the weird edges that were left. And now it sits on the wall with a little magnet sort of hidden behind that flap at the top, a little round magnet. And this is the last work I'm going to show you, which is made in a mold. And, when you work with molds, you're supposed to keep them perfectly level. That's kind of a rule of the process. And so I've intentionally placed the mold at a slight angle, and I've intentionally not filled the mold with resin. And then I laid a piece of bubble wrap, particular kind of bubble wrap. It's the kind that comes in Amazon packages. It has a particular shape of bubble. I laid that in the wet resin, which was tinted with this dry powdered pigment that is this kind of greenish yellowish color. And then when it dried and it's set up, I pulled the plastic bubble wrap off of the dried resin. And of course, the resin retained the impression, the bubble wrap. So this is like another way of thinking about, I've shown you a lot of images where I've rubbed the bubble wrap on the mylar. But this is kind of another way of thinking about the space that those bubbles leave behind. And that's all I've got for you tonight, but thank you.
Thank you. Questions? Comments?
Yes.
Very interesting stage, and I really enjoyed my project. I think I'm mostly interested in the one you rated and like the physics. Then I saw like more photo it has like a reflection of another one. So like
Wait, sorry, say that again, because it's a little hard to hear.
in like the part on the floor. And it seems like the one the photo you took years ago, it's like the one on the floor and the one on the floor that they're reflecting at
Each other.
like in the reflection on the floor, reflecting the one on the floor, it's like very interesting. Like, like, also like using like reflection and user those kind of interactions and do that.
Well, I'm, you know, I like to keep a really light touch with those things because there's kind of a lot of magic that happens anyway, just as the pieces live in the world. And I'm not so interested in creating those effects. I'm more interested in setting up the conditions for some kind of magic to happen, but it's not necessarily a magic that I'm making, if that makes any sense.
You are making pieces. You work on them several years after, and some pieces seem to change because of the material you are using. Like for instance, the piece who was red become green or blue.
Right.
Are you documenting those changes?
No.
And
Because
do you think, but I guess you expect that those pieces and the one you are creating now are gonna change again.
they might change, yeah, they might change, but I'm not,
You're not looking for that, that's the same time you're asking for the values.
yeah. It is part of the process, but I'm like, I've thought about when I do slide talks, like maybe I should show an image of the original piece that was red, because I could do that, I could show that to you. But to me, that's not so interesting. It's more, maybe it's more mysterious when I tell you that it was red and now it's olive green, because you have to believe me. Whereas, or you might believe me, because I'm not lying about it, but it's sort of, it feels too didactic to me to like, to document each changing state of the piece. Yeah,
That's what I love so much about the work is like seeing the presentation on a screen, and like from a photograph, but I love that question of like, you know, what does it look like? Like what does, I have no idea.
right,
Because you're only seeing it via photography, and then I'm only seeing it via like the presentation, or I'm not as a weird question of like, you know, what does the work look like? And I think so much artwork can be like, oh, it has, you know, a black border or like a red swipe, you know, in the top right corner. Like your work doesn't necessarily exist in that same realm. And it's also what I love about it is like you have to be there to see it. And I have no question. That's
thanks.
super fascinating. Yeah, that's very cool.
I have a question.
Yeah,
When you talked about like, how you have rules in the process of making, but also rules for some of these pieces in terms of how they are installed.
mhm,
And I think it's really, fun to kind of think about your authorship or your ownership of the work and how much. I think it seems like you don't want to be the determinant of like, how the work is experienced, but then I guess what I wanted to ask is like, have you ever, you know, say you have a group show in Reykjavik and you're like not making the flight there, do you send very specific instructions of how, I'm not
Yeah.
sure which pieces were in that show?
Yeah. I do send really detailed instructions,
Okay.
but I also, you know, I didn't go to that show in Reykjavik, and so I had to rely on the gallery's discretion in terms of, because they know their space. So, you know, and I also thought of, well, maybe I could ask the gallery to change, you know, because I showed you all the different pictures of how you could actually reconfigure that piece. And I thought, oh, maybe I could ask the gallery to change it once a week or something. But I realized I would actually have to be there to do that degree of intervention. So I kind of think that, I think there's a sort of in between authorship where it's like a provisional authorship, right? And also, yeah, the rules change.
Yeah.
So I'm also open to the fact that I might make a different decision 5 years from now about any piece that I just showed you that I say has to be installed in a particular way. Like, I don't know, like, for me, as it stands now, this work must be installed in that space where the wall meets the floor. But, you know, maybe 5 years from now, I might change my mind about that. I don't know.
Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah.
Hi, thank you for your presentation. You mentioned that you transform along with your own work into near pieces, and how do you decide which work still you're going to do? Is it mainly based on whether you like it, or if you can afford it, that is more potential than that?
Well, how did I make what was the criteria that I used? There were a couple of different ones. So one was duds that I had kept that weren't really like finished works. But I had kept them for some reason, so I could easily go back into those. The other one was, it's very subjective. Like, I mean, of course, I'm not destroying all of my older work, but I am destroying some of it selectively. I guess I'm like sacrificing the ones that I just feel don't interest me very much anymore. Or where there's a flaw, like perhaps the color shifted, or there's a scratch, or because also they're really fragile surfaces. So I guess there's 3 different criteria. One is completely subjective, it doesn't fit my protocol. One is there's a flaw. And the third one is it's something I perceive as a dud. Yeah.
Thank you very much. I'm kind of wondering as well, in terms of like the decision about making your work and being lunch, the set of rules that you have also play with all of these things that you need to chance. And I'm wondering what is it, what drives you to decide what is the rule and what?
That's always a really tricky question. I mean, that could change from one day to the next too, because like I said, I'm always looking for things that are going to surprise me a little bit, or processes that go awry. So deciding whether one kind of going awry is okay, but another kind of going awry is not okay, is complicated. Ultimately super subjective. Yeah.
So you, in your work, you talk about these surprises or mistakes or like, you know, general things that weren't anticipated. But what is your relationship to those surprises? Is it just happiness? Are you just excited? And then how have you seen that like correlate to your? Because like, you know, I get that. That like pleasant surprise of like perfect dream. Chasing a thing, you know, an image, a line. So what does it do for you conceptually or maybe even emotionally?
Well, I mean, it's tricky because I also have to keep it fresh. So it's like I can't necessarily, you know, if I wanted to, I suppose I could really orchestrate all the mistakes and surprises and things, but I don't want to do that. So does it make me happy? No, sometimes I'll get something and it'll be like really bugging me for about 6 months until I realize, no, that's really interesting after all. So I spend a lot of time looking at my own work in the studio, maybe not actually doing anything, and or having a certain kind of patience where, you know, I go back to something that I thought, you know, I was done with 2 months ago, but actually No, I could do something else to it. So I try and keep as nimble as I can with the way that I work, if that makes any sense.
Yeah, so it could be like a little bit transcendental, but it could also be a little bit like transient, like it's just coming to this. I feel like there's a transcendence to that, you know, something that like feels like as a viewer, since you explained it to me, is elevating my like my relationship to the world physically. Is there an expectation or that you have, or would you like your viewers to have? Especially considering a lot of instances, they don't get to know exactly what was the happy accident.
Yeah, they don't know. They don't know when they see the work in a show or something, what was the accident, but I don't really want them to. Because that's not important to me that they know where the accident was. It's more important to, well, for myself, it just shakes things up a little bit. So if it's, I'm kind of like, I position myself as the ideal viewer, let's say, in my studio. That's what I do, right? So if it surprises me, and I'm super familiar with the work, then I think, oh, okay, that's interesting. Does that make sense?
Yeah, I like the term ideal viewer. Often I've like labeled myself in my studio an unreliable narrator. So the ideal viewer is a lot better.
Yeah.
Super quick, just a technical material question. How would you mount silver mylar to a wood panel?
So I use different things. Sometimes I used to use a kind of double-sided adhesive film called Gudio, but that I found out is not very permanent. It's got like adhesive on both sides. But that's also enabled me to be able to peel them quite easily. I use jade adhesive, or I can also use gel medium.
Like for these like drawings or like works on paper that I've put on panel, like used gel media before, but I'm just resetting my work, but like is there a specific gel medium or like specific
I like,
process of putting it on that like you can just take a sheet and lay it out and sort of.
are you're mounting paper to wood panel?
Yeah.
So it's absorbent. So I would recommend jade adhesive or jade glue, which you can get at Talus in East Williamsburg. And it's a particular kind of PVA adhesive that's kind of archival, but it's also pretty sticky. And then, you know, like I use rollers that have for a very smooth nap.
Yeah.
So and then I roll over it when it's wet.
Jade adhesive.
Jade adhesive, yeah.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. I really loved your voice and your words and your work. And I'm just curious about what's your relationship between you and your artwork, since your work is kind of like bunch of shapeshifter, I mean they constantly change. Do you feel like you made them, or they are kind of exist as your friend or another entity?
No,
That's one question. And the second is,
Yeah.
can you remember which pieces, since they change constantly? That you could, if someone asked you to send in a word, you can send me anything that pretty much you call a word that is yours.
Wait, I don't understand the second part of the question, but I'll answer the first part first, which is I definitely feel like I made them. Even though I say that I relinquish the role of author to a certain extent, I still feel like that's a decision that I made, that I'm doing that for certain reasons conceptually, that that in an attempt to ask the viewer to be a more engaged viewer. Oh, for the viewer to be able to step into the role of author to some degree. So that, but that's still my decision that I am doing that. So yeah, I definitely feel like I made that.
What I mean is not that you didn't make it, I was like, because sometimes I feel like some people would think. The words kind of speak through them, you know, it's kind of like, oh, this is, you're just kind of.
Like I'm the vehicle
Yeah.
for it to happen. Well, I think that's true generally of all of us anyway, in general, regardless of how it works, but yeah. Yeah.
Thank you so much for. So about like, how do you know when the work is finished and like it's the point that you don't want to work at it?
That is the $1 million question all the time. I think that's the question that we all face all the time. Like, how do you know when something's finished? Well, part of how you know it's finished is if it fulfills, like it would, you know, I was talking about rules and protocols and criteria. So if you kind of have your criteria, if your criteria has been satisfied somehow and by what you're seeing that you're making, then I think you have a sense of whether it's finished or not.
Yeah.
Yeah.
I think it's really cool that you like to work on one that to make the graduate content. And then every time you document your artwork, you can icon. And then but it as an audience, it's a one of the artwork, and then you will get your own use document. I think the artwork is like the artwork is expanding because lot of reflection happens there, and then it's so much for writing to be considered the reflection.
Wait, sorry, just say that last bit again. Maybe take your mask off so I can hear you better.
Consider the reflection of your artwork, like the tripod, the photography, everyone to like study in your artwork. So, like what is your own opinion about the reflection of
Well, I also chose the photographs that I showed you, right? So I mean, I usually take all the pictures of my own work, and when I have like sometimes galleries have sent photographers to document the work, and I'm almost never satisfied with the photographs. So the photographs become a whole different project in a way than separate from the work. And the photographs really lie, you know, because they say, I feel like they lie because, you know, you're never going to see that work in my studio necessarily. If you see it, you're going to see it in a gallery, and it's going to be a very different situation. So there is a kind of funny, yeah, fiction that goes on in the documentation. I'm not sure if that answers your question.
it's still the reflection on your already like it's different that's being a tripod there, rather than your hand holding your phone to document.
There's a different feeling, I mean, yeah. Yeah, and I often like to have the tripod there or myself just to remind the viewer that it is reflective, it's not a picture. It's being, it's sort of a device, I would say. Yeah.
I also think that if you saw this piece in Carrie's studio, it wouldn't look like that.
It's true.
She, the way from the position you would be standing in, or, you know, even the fact that this thing is above us, I mean, everything about all of you, what we're seeing is somehow, fantasy. And so I think that you saw in the studio, and depending on where you're standing and what the lighting is, so much.
Yeah.
That's time to think about Mary's word is that
it's never static. Now you can call them paintings and you can call them this, but there's always this mutability that's always happening, and you, as a viewer, are helping for that to happen. Because you're moving, by like just turning your head there.
Well, that's why I thought definitely where the work is. It's something that we can.
Yeah.
Yeah, awesome.
And just that, I wanted to say this, and then it falls in sort of just what Joy just said, that like my first reaction when I see you work on slides, we're gonna see it in a book or something, is like, you gotta see the actual piece, you know? And so part of me has this immediate, a little bit sense of like a disappointment a little bit, and then part of it is like a secret, like only those who've seen it like really know what's happening. But then I really appreciate like the lecture itself and like making us imagine everything that's happening. So like this is kind of its own piece in itself, like beyond the actual piece. But I also want to say, like, when you do see the pieces, or you know, when I see the pieces in person, especially like in a like you know, one of the solo shows or something, one of the things that is so important or really strikes me is both light, which you spoke to a little bit, but also movement, you know, like the way you move and the way the viewer is constantly moving and performing in front of the piece, and then just seeing the piece the whole time. How much does that movement play when you're actually making an individual piece, or is that always something that then happens within the space, the installation?
I think that has bearing on how I choose to install work in an exhibition, but certainly in my studio, since I am always moving and I'm saying like if I am the idealized viewer, like I'm getting to experience that facet of the work all the time. And sometimes people have said, oh, you should take videos of your work, but I feel like that I kind of don't want to do that because I feel like that's, I don't know.
It's another setup.
It's another setup, that's another kind of fiction that is even more elaborate fiction, maybe. So.
Yeah, I had that gut reaction too. It's like, I have the video here, can we just? But then I was like, but then that, yeah, it's a different kind of explaining, but takes away from the way the imagination works and the way that you're presenting it.
But I also think that there's something super interesting about, especially in the moment that we're living in, where everything's like Instagram or Facebook, and you know, a million images constantly taken on. It can't be photographed, you know. You have to see it for real. It's in the real world. There's you know, even though it plays on all these other things, there's something super exciting about it. Something that, you know, you think you might have saw, but you didn't see it, right? And it's only you having the conversation with that object that becomes what you will retain or remember, take from that.
Right, and I also think, well, since it relates to what Nelson was saying, that I'm also interested, and I can't really convey it in the pictures, but like in that fleetingness of you, the viewer, moving through the space, because you can never really find, like you might see a piece and you see it from one particular angle at one moment, and you can never find that moment again as you're walking around. So I'm kind of interested in that kind of, that it slips away from the viewer's desire to apprehend. That's an interesting dynamic.
And also, ironically, a lot of it has this reflective, so but it's still a slide.
I had another question, which is to do a little bit less with some of the work that you showed here. Hopefully, it isn't too broad of a question. But kind of, I wanted to ask about the relationship Or if you could talk about maybe like the relationship between your practice as an artist and as an activist. You know, I think that the bulk of the kind of paintings that we've talked about today are, you know, so much about the material and the sensation and the fleetingness and those things. You know, I think with the Archipelago works, you're sort of being a little bit more direct in terms of there being a content that I just that ties directly to something that you've been concerned about and outside the studio. And I think the Archipelago works do that in a way that's really subtle and beautiful and still kind of lives in this world of fleetingness and something that's kind of poetic. And but yeah, I just wanted to offer a chance for you to talk about that maybe a little bit because it wasn't a huge part of your presentation.
Yeah.
Or also you don't have to talk about it or not. I didn't mean to put you on the spot.
No, I think there's I think, you know, I don't think it's like too highfalutin to say that I think there's a politic involved in a kind of what, I mean, formalism used to be a really bad word, you know, but I think I kind of am a big believer in a certain kind of formalism, and I feel like there's also a politic built into paying attention to the specificities of situations and sites and conditions. So I think that relates to activism. I'm also really involved with a collective called Fierce Pussy that Joy is also a member of. There are 4 of us, and that kind of is happening concurrent to my individual practice, but is a very different form of engagement. So, and it's really refreshing to be able to make decisions collectively about art, what are artworks really that Fierce Pussy makes, that are collaboratively arrived at. That's like that. There is, I'm not even really sure how it feeds back. I know that all of our individual practices feed the collective. I'm not sure how the collective work feeds back into my individual practice, except that it's like exercising a very different muscle than you exercise by yourself in a solitary pursuit in your studio. Yes.